All right, and welcome everyone. So today's event is going to be in a webinar format. That means that you are going to be able to see the panelists, which is myself. I'm Carol Glasser. I'm the chair of the Animals and Society section for the American Sociological Association. Ivy Collier, who's the executive director for today's event's other sponsor, which is the Animals and Society Institute. I went ahead and put a link up to that in the chat. So if you aren't on their mailing list, please be sure that you get on it. And Tom Aleo. Did I do it right, Tom? Tom Aleo? Tom Aleo. All right. I'm so sorry for that.
Well, not quite, but I mean, that's close enough. It's way better than most people do.
Sorry. It's important to get names correct, and I'm sorry that I mispronounced yours. So you'll be able to see Tom's face and his screen for most of this event. We have two other features. We have a chat feature and a question and answer feature. So if you have a question that you would like us to pose to Tom when we get to the question and answer portion, please put it in the question and answer box, and I will be sure to field those questions. We also have a chat feature. I really encourage you to use the chat feature throughout the talk. Ivy is going to be watching that feature. I'll be looking at it throughout the talk. And so hopefully we'll get a good conversation going in and around this talk as well, because we know that in 1 hour, we can't possibly address everything. And so it would be great to get that chat going so that we can make sure that we address all the things that everyone's interested in here. So without any further explanation, we're going to begin today's event. And I would like to introduce Tom. Tom Aleo. Did I do it right that time?
Well, close enough. It was good. It was good.
Just say it for us.
It's ILO.
ILO.
I'm
so sorry. Okay.
It's a weird one.
This new Zoom world is really interesting, an email world where we're not meeting in person as much. You read names more than you say them.
Right?
I'm recognizing.
It's very true.
So I'm sincerely sorry. Tom Aiello is a professor of anthropology, history, and Africana studies at Valdosta State University. I'm just so nervous now. I'm going to mispronounce everything. He is the author of more than 20 books and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles. His work helped amend the Louisiana Constitution to make non-humanist juries illegal and was cited in the United States Supreme Court as part of its decision ruling them unconstitutional. He holds PhDs in history and anthrozoology. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat a link to where you can see more of Tom's work and see some of the things that he's written. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And listen, I pronounce my own name wrong all the time. So, I mean, that's no big deal. It's a weird one. So I thought what I would do is I would talk for a little while, probably about for the little bit less than the first half of an hour. And then the second half of the hour, we could use for questions and discussion. Since this is billed as something for that. So with that said, let me get started. Pornocrates, this picture here, is the most influential work of Belgian artist Félicien Rops, featuring a naked woman with a blindfold walking behind a tethered pig on a marble floor as angels fly away. The work caused a lot of controversy on its first appearance, and it's been interpreted by critics and art historians as representing a variety of different possibilities. Perhaps the pig is representative of men leading along women. Perhaps the pig is a stand-in for luxury and sloth. By viewing art history through an anthrozoological lens, however, the meaning of works such as that of Félicien Rops changes significantly, moving depicted animals from stolid symbols of human frailties and successes to consideration of their presence as entities with their own meanings, as something more than means to some symbolic ends. The work of Félicien Rops existed at the intersection of symbolism and decadence, two artistic movements in the Gilded Age, where he exploited the sexual ambiguities inherent in the symbolist repertoire. but he did vacillate from his symbolist roots to occasional realistic work. While non-human animals were rarely part of his painting, they did appear and demonstrated the variety of his form. This is Japanese salamander and beetle. It's a nature study painted in the style of Japanese woodblocks. In Separated, or Simian Spring, Rops is more abrupt, more aggressive. There's no overt pro-animal message in Separated, but the image of two individuals separated from one another, one seeking to get to his companion while the other looks away in presumed depression, does seem to present at least a nod to a liberatory politics of animals. Rops is more explicit in a third work, The Cat. The cat is far more stentorian, with smooth lines and a realistic presentation. A cat sits proudly on a chair in a lush setting. But just below the cat, imprinted on the chair, is the phrase amica non serva, a Latin phrase meaning friend, not servant. The picture itself does not seem to push a determined animal rights agenda, and Rops's biography doesn't include that kind of advocacy, to be honest with you, but it would have been difficult for anyone to see the cat and not interpret it as a plea in some measure for domestic animals. The cat stares at the viewer like Derrida's cat stared at him, providing an emperor has no clothes moment that leaves those seen by the cat feeling similarly vulnerable. Rops's most influential work, though, was clearly Pornocrates, the work he is most famous for. It originally appeared in 1878, this nearly naked, blindfolded woman holding a rope that leashes a pig, with the angels flying away. The woman and the pig stand on a stage that includes a frieze featuring representations of the four traditional arts: sculpture, music, literature, and painting. Then below them is another frieze that features the word Pornocrates written in Greek. The pig in Pornocrates stands tall, at alert, the focused leader of the woman whose blindfold makes her dependent upon his leadership. The pig is looking up, his neck in an unnatural position that creates the assumption of dog-like vigilance from a non-human animal whose neck has evolved to keep his head pointed toward the ground. His legs are straight and slim, his body lean. And thus, Rops's pig is an idealized representation, a pig painted by someone largely unfamiliar with pigs, fitting the woman's idealized sexuality and the friez's idealization of the arts. The various interpretations of the painting that have appeared since its debut, however, ignore another idealized presentation, one of actual human behavior toward actual pigs, a phenomenon known as blind pig races. Pig races started to gain popularity in the 1820s and became a common activity in Europe and the United States in the 1860s, the decade prior to Rops's painting. A pig was tethered to a rope, and humans walked behind them, attempting to control them and make their way to a predetermined finish line. The human participants were not always women, but based on extant photos of such events, women tended to participate more than men. The only real difference between blind pig races and the depiction in Pornocrates is that outside of the artistic representation, both the pigs and the humans have their heads tilted toward the ground. Of course, such is not to say that Rops is necessarily depicting a version of a blind pig race, but there is in his depiction a reference with which contemporary viewers would have been familiar. One of the most common ways that many would have ever come into contact with living pigs. That is to say, that while the naked woman with sexually provocative accoutrement is standard fare for Rops, it's reasonable to assume, against the assumption of previous art historians, that the role of the pig in Pornocrates is more than symbolic. That the pig in Pornocrates is, in fact, a pig. Go figure. While such might seem a minor point, I think it's significant because often the position of animals in art and fiction is reduced in commentary and criticism to symbolism, as it is usually assumed that the humans creating the artistic product are speaking to a human concern and using animal tropes to make some kind of broader point. Thus, the pig leading the naked woman is decadence, affluence, or the male chauvinist pig. But if non-human animals are interpreted as non-human animals, then not only are animal forms treated with more respect in historical art criticism, but other interpretations of the painting become possible, like blind pig races. Like the pigs sent to Belgian abattoirs every day, the pig in Pornocrates hid in plain sight to those who viewed the painting with outrage or disdain. Just as the naked woman in Rops's paintings impacted the way humans thought about prostitutes, pornography, and women more broadly, the pig in Rops's most infamous work impacted negative Western stereotypes toward pigs. Those stereotypes then made it easier for their plight to disappear from human vision and reduce them to nothing more than signifiers. Well, this story, I hope, is at least marginally interesting. And it has something important to say about animals on a couple of different trajectories. At the same time, this story that I just told you looks very different than, say, this paper. I can say without equivocation that these scholars did great work in crafting this paper concerning pet caretaking and the risk of mild cognitive impairment and dementia in older US adults. But I can also say with equal certitude that I don't care about pet caretaking and risk of mild cognitive impairment and dementia in older US adults. And that the scope of that paper is far from the story I just told you about Pornocrates, as would be the sociological study of American dementia is from a work of Belgian art history. The reality is, we have tons of disciplines that deal with tons of different human concerns. And in a perfect world, we would have just as many that deal with all of the different animal concerns that exist. But because we are a relatively new field, because of the human supremacy that generated the stereotypes I talked about a minute ago, and that created the concept of humanities itself, we are all of us who deal with animals lumped under one umbrella. I know when I look at a history journal that the articles might be about subjects I'm unfamiliar with, but they'll be written in a form, a jargon, with a notational style that I understand. They will be in the language of historians. And as an historian, I'll be able to understand it. This, however, is not my language, even though in a disciplinary manner, it should be. The disparate nature of that divergence between languages, or to keep with the metaphor, the wide cope of that umbrella, can make publishing in this brave new world a troubling thing. ASI's website lists these 24 journals as emphasizing various elements of human-animal studies. By comparison, there are well over 100 history journals in the United States and thousands in the world. But there are even more complications. History journals publish works of history. I have no doctrinal dispute with any of them. I may not agree with the conclusions of some of the articles they publish, but there was no philosophical problem with them that would keep me from wanting to associate with any of those history journals. But let's go back to our dementia patients. This article is published in one of the leading human animal studies journals, Anthrozoos, published by the International Society for Anthrozoology. It is funded largely by pet food companies and other corporate entities that make their living trading in dead animals. Its articles are often interesting, but often those articles are about the role animals play in human lives, not necessarily about animals themselves. And they aren't concerned about the integrity of those animals. As a comparison, the Journal of African American History is one of the most respected historical journals in the country. But if it was discovered that it received funding from the Oath Keepers and Fox News, those of us who care about and write Black history would stop reading it and writing for it. Now, as someone who comes from critical animal studies, I draw a harder line than many might draw. But if we go back to our list, we'll see that there is only one critical animal studies journal on the ASI website, even though critical animal studies casts almost as long a shadow as animal studies itself. All of these intersections can cause real apprehension, if not outright frustration, with those who are working in the field and wanting to publish their work. Who exactly is our audience? Animal studies people aren't one tribe. We're a bunch of tribes, all living on a relatively small plot of land, and it can be an area that is difficult to navigate. Here are a couple of pins to put in your virtual map that hopefully can help with some of the minutiae. Number one, publishing good work in any of the animal studies journals listed on the ASI page will get anthrozoological eyeballs on your work. The content of your writing is more important than the name on the cover of the journal. Number two, anthrozoological eyeballs wander over myriad journals outside of the ASI list. The Pornocrates work that I told you about earlier is from a paper that I currently have under submission, not to an animal studies journal, but to an art history journal. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, non-animal people still find animal things interesting. The benefit of our discipline is that describing the lived realities of animals within a constructed human social context not only furthers our understanding of animals themselves, but also proves revelatory to those who place the bulk of their own research on human-specific concerns, showing them holes in their thinking about the interconnectedness of living beings on the globe. And second, and I think most importantly, most of us, not all of us to be sure, which is fine, but most of us got into this business to use our academic skills to help animals. One of the best ways to help animals with your work is to get the message that your research presents into the hands of those who still have those holes in their thinking, to preach the importance of non-humans to humans of all different kinds. ASI's Society in Animals is one of my favorite journals in the world. But the vast majority of people who read it are going to be of at least relatively like mind than me. But those who read Ode Holland, the world's oldest surviving art history journal that deals with the art of Belgium and the Netherlands and people like Félicien Rops, they probably don't have that like mind. Getting the Pornocrates message that we talked about earlier to that new audience is value added to both the discipline and to the reasons you entered it in the first place. And of course, we are, in a manner of speaking, biding our time. More journals in our field will come. I'm planning to start one that deals specifically with critical studies of animals in history, art, and literature. But until then, that's just wishful thinking. Until then, cast a wide net. With SSRN, academia.edu, ResearchGate, and other vehicles, it is easier than ever for people to find your work outside of the journals specifically focusing on animals. Book publishing, of course, is more open. Most academic presses will send animal studies work out for peer review, as all animal studies material relates at least tangentially to an already established human discipline. In addition, there are a variety of presses with animal studies series. Brill has both a human animal studies series and a critical animal studies series. My mentor, Samantha Hearn, edits one of 2 animal studies series with Routledge. Penn State, Duke, Minnesota, and others have animal studies series in their catalogs. The options on that front will grow as well. But if I may, let me go briefly back to our doctrinal disciplines and our doctrinal disciplinary differences. We are a discipline with multiple languages, multiple emphases, multiple concerns, and not all of them are in concert with one another. Some people see that as a source of frustration. They wall themselves off and refuse to talk to those who they disagree with. I don't see it as a source of frustration, though. Whatever I might think of anthrozoos, I'm in it too. If our discipline is to grow, if we are to get more programs and departments in universities in the United States and around the world, we have to develop in as many directions as possible. Show as many existing fields as there are that their work is incomplete if it ignores the bulk of the world's population. Conflict creates growth. And as long as we talk to one another, take each other's research seriously, even if it isn't our thing, if it has a different philosophical bent, even if it isn't something we agree with, because it is through those conversations, knowing that even if we aren't in the same tribe, we occupy the same land. The best thing we can do is argue and get along at the same time. Create new opportunities to publish by publishing what we're doing now, realizing that the work you feel doesn't have a home is exactly the kind of work that creates a stepping stone for the researcher who finds what you're doing and moves in a different direction because of it. When you do that, you help grow the discipline. And when you help grow the discipline, you help animals, even if only a little bit. Because for them, every little bit helps. And before we take questions, I'd like to briefly deal with some of the nuts and bolts basics about publishing in the field and about submitting your work more broadly. Most will probably find this a little on the nose. But for those of you who are students, or for those of you who are new to the practice or to the discipline, navigating the basics, particularly with that divergence between languages that we talked about, can be intimidating without hearing about generic nuts and bolts kind of things. So, to that end, first, one need not simply choose from the ASI journal list or find a journal outside of anthrozoological study to publish their work. So many journals in tangential fields publish special issues dealing with animals. The Humanistic Psychologist, for example, recently published a special section on the human-animal relationship and is planning another for which a call for papers is out now. To find such opportunities, Listservs and monthly newsletters are the ties that bind. Hopefully, you are all familiar with ASI's monthly newsletter. It might be the way you found this talk. We have already, Carol put it in the chat already, that it is there for you to sign up for. Its newsletter includes calls for papers from a variety of different disciplines that have anything to do with animal studies. The Australasian Animal Studies Association's newsletter does much the same thing. Brooks Animal Law Digest does something similar for animal legal issues. Perhaps the most important resource that we have for publishing in animal studies is H-Animal, part of HNet, the humanities network operated out of Michigan State. Subscribing to H-Animal is one of the most important things you can do to discover in real time what calls for papers are available at any given moment. And for the grad students, while you're doing that, you need to subscribe to H-Grad as well. It is almost just as important, a vital resource for graduate students and a place to vent where professors are specifically barred from joining. So you can say anything bad about us you want and we will never know. Second, because of our broad disciplinary scope, citation styles vary widely for the different journals that are willing to accept animal studies work. The humanistic psychologist, for example, which we just mentioned, publishes in APA, while all of the history journals with which I am most familiar publish in Chicago. And I have Chicago in bigger letters because I like it best. Then there's MLA, ASA, Harvard, and others. When you work in the field of history, you can learn the Chicago Manual of Style and assume that you are covered for any problem that might arise in citations. That isn't the case in our field. We need to be at least passingly familiar with all of them. The easiest way to transition your work from its original citation style to the one a potential journal uses is the Purdue Online Writing Lab, which has easy explanations of the various citation styles that will allow you, with at least relative alacrity, to shift your notes to the proper format. Third, and finally, the key to a good submission for you graduate students is a strong cover letter, because it can often be the only thing that those making decisions read with any actual care. And again, I know this is low-hanging fruit for many of you, but I think we take it as just an assumed thing so often that we forget that those unfamiliar with the process often never hear these basic things. If you are affiliated with the university as a graduate student, you should have access to your department's letterhead. It is always a good idea to put your cover letter on letterhead. In your opening paragraph, make sure to include a word count to let the editor know that your submission falls within the required range. After a brief introduction, then provide a brief summary of the article you're submitting. And actually, probably a much briefer one than this. This letter here that I'm using, I probably had way too much summary than I needed to here. This might not be the best example. Then you want a brief biographical paragraph about yourself, followed by a thank you that includes your contact information. To some, this might seem super obvious. To others, maybe not. It sometimes seems that we are in this field walking blindly, led only by a pig, or at least by our passion for pigs and for other animals. But hopefully, with some of this information firmly in hand, we'll be able to pull the blindfolds from our eyes and maybe even put on some clothes. So I hope that one day we'll have a stronger disciplinary unity that gives us one relatively uniform citation style. And I unabashedly hope that it's Chicago. And I hope that one day we'll have scores of journals producing work in all aspects of animal studies across the broad spectrum of disciplinary categories. And I hope that one day every university within the sound of my voice will have a dedicated animal studies program. But until then, our good work and ability to adapt will help create more and better publishing opportunities and help grow our young discipline into something that will be an assumed part of every collegiate curriculum. Thank you very much. And I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was wonderful. We already have a question in the Q&A forum, so I will just read that one word for word. It's very well stated. It's by Maisie. Thank you to Tom. If our aim is to get our work out to a wider audience, publishing books with houses who publish in a more affordable paperback would seem a good thing to do. Do you or anyone else have recommendations? I believe Brill isn't that affordable for student audiences from memory.
Absolutely. That is a great point. So a lot of the answer to that question depends on where you're located. In the US, the vast majority of university presses in the US publish now in trade paperbacks. And so with the books that I have published, I go with American university presses, and even if they put out a hardback, I ensure in the contract that there will also be a paperback as well, because I want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to read it. You're right. We are stuck in a weird loop here, because the most affordable books to buy are ones from commercial houses. Commercial houses, however, are relatively reluctant to publish new work. They're relatively reluctant to publish on animals. And B, they don't have peer review, which is kind of the core bedrock of what we think of ourselves as doing here when we're doing foundational research. So I always try to look for publishing houses that will create a book that will cost less than $30. That is totally doable, at least in the United States. I'm not familiar with university houses elsewhere, but in the United States, that is completely doable. But you're right, Brill and Routledge, for all of their great work, charge a lot. And the reason for that is because the vast market for their books is for libraries. And they're selling to libraries, and they can jack up the price to libraries to make them available to everybody. So if you do not have an option of finding a relatively low-cost university press to publish with, and you end up going with one of the older, more established academic presses that publish in hardback and focus their work on libraries, like Routledge or Brill, the way you get around that is by directing your potential readers to local libraries where your book is held and making sure that you know on WorldCat where your books are being held. Or B, and maybe more importantly, using the tools like ResearchGate, academia, and SSRN to put sections of that work. You won't be able to put the whole thing up there. They won't. They'll bust you for copyright on that. But putting sections of your work up on those sites to allow people to get access to them whenever they want. That way, your book still goes into libraries around the world, and individuals who may not have access to those libraries can still get the core of your arguments from your sites on one of those drivers of free academic resources.
Tom, so we have someone who I'm going to actually let talk. They said they had a couple questions. I don't know if you prefer to have your screen showing or prefer to have you showing during the Q&A.
It doesn't matter.
It's completely up to you, but right now we're just seeing your screen.
Okay. How about that? Can you see me now?
Small. Yep, we see you.
All right.
We see you were a little, but now we can see you larger. So I'm going to go ahead, and I have to find. So Ken Shapiro said that he had a couple questions that would be easier to ask over audio. So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and let you unmute yourself, and you should be able to talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can.
And just so you know, your video pops up when you talk as well. Your video is not turned on, but I just want to give you that warning that happens.
I don't see immediately how to do that. It doesn't list my video. Anyway.
Okay.
So yeah, Tom, I wanted to address, first of all, wonderful talk, elegantly done, lovely illustrations, and I finally now know how to pronounce your last name. So I
think it's about time.
Yeah, it's about time. Yeah, well, we were on first name basis first, and now we're.
That's right.
That's right. So no, I just wanted to address the point about the pros of publishing in devoted journals versus journals in the many disciplines that interface with animal studies or human animal studies. So I just want to open that up for a little bit of discussion. So let me make a couple of comments about it, and then perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so certainly casting a wide net is critical, and we in effect are doing missionary work. We're reaching out to the other disciplines and saying,
absolutely true.
Look, there is a subfield within your major discipline that definitely could be enriched by doing human-animal interface studies. On the other hand, it's important, it seems to me, to maintain the robustness of the animal-devoted journals.
Definitely.
And that's because there's a couple of goals that are served by that increased robustness. One is that I think it's an incentive to develop devoted programs, majors, minors, concentrations, whatever, centers in the universities.
Right.
Yeah, so that's important. The other thing that I think it can do more readily is that, and we now encourage people who publish in Society and Animals to include in their papers the policy implications of their study, so that we're coming down onto the ground and helping those pigs, not just talking about them.
Right, that's a great idea.
So I think we proceed both ways. I encourage people as a first priority to publish in their own discipline, particularly those disciplines that have not yet established a core group of scholars who are doing that interface.
Right.
So I mean, it's less critical in sociology, for example, which already has an established political and academic foot in its own major field. Other fields that are just coming on board, like the performing arts, for example, archaeology, for example, there, I think to get into those journals that perhaps have not published in this interface area yet is more critical. So, anyway, it's a mixed argument. I just wanted to put that out there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think both are important, and you're right. I mean, I think the ultimate goal is that we are trying to create a core body of knowledge that will allow other universities to see our legitimacy, so that we will get departments and programs and things like that. If the goal of a university is ultimately to disseminate knowledge upwards and out to the people through those journals and through books, and disseminate it downwards to students, then we need to have more downwards avenues as well as upwards avenues. We need to be able to create those programs. And you're right, it is kind of foundational journals that do that work. But I think missionary is kind of the right word. I mean, I very much see it that way sometimes, where I think history is the discipline where I started in is history, for those of you. I think it's one of those, like performing arts, that was a little bit late to the game. Even though so much of what we see in Society and Animals and other journals is doing a version of history. It's not doing a version of history that's necessarily done by historians, because historians themselves have always been late to kind of every new revelation in the academy. And so, so I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a necessary effort to try to show people who we are, but at the same time, make sure that our own foundations are as strong as absolutely possible, so that when we do get those eyeballs, there is something impressive for them to see.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple higher level questions like the ones Ken was asking, and then some very specific how-tos. So I think I'm going to take on the higher level questions, a couple of those now, and then I'm going to make sure I cut us off so we save some time for these very specific how-to questions that we have here as well.
Yeah.
So Anna brings up a very specific anecdote, and I want to read her anecdote and then sort of loop it into a larger question. Okay. So Anna talks about how she's not an academic, but she's drawing a graphic novel about the use of animal parts as aphrodisiacs, and would love to support to get her message out and cope with the real facts that are disturbing to draw, but feels are still important to convey, she says, but somehow without insulting the people that use them. And I think that, so I think this is a very real world example, right? So how do I do this thing and speak to this wider audience without insulting them? And I think that also speaks to some of the questions that came up for me when you talked about maybe we should put things so this is talking about maybe a non-academic sense, but also if we're doing academic work and maybe our disciplinary journal that's not an animal studies journal, there's a larger question there of, do we have to edit or change our work somehow to speak to that audience rather than unabashedly being human animal studies or critical animal studies scholars, right? Does Anna have to change the way she does her graphic novel? Do I have to refrain from using non-human animals as a term or other animals as a term? Are there things that you think we have to do when we go to these mainstream audiences or disciplinary audiences that are outside of our field? And if so, do you have a sense of what those things are and whether they're okay to do?
That's a great question. And I think depending on who you ask, you're going to get very different answers. My answer is that I unequivocally refuse to change my language when I go outside of animal studies journals. And again, I think the online process is one of the reasons for that, because with dozens of people hitting your academia.edu page every day, I mean, even if they decide they don't want that kind of language, you can still get your paper out into a format where people can find it. I have never been, will tell my own anecdote. I had an article rejected at the Journal of American History a couple of years ago, precisely because it sounded too militant. And of course, it was a history paper. It wasn't militant. It just used things like non-human animals. It assumed non-human animals to be equal to humans. And so when it calculated deaths, humans and animal deaths, I did not distinguish between the two. Things like that, which seem perfectly normal in my world, but in the Journal of American History, that seems like it seems like something so far afield that they just couldn't handle it. And I refused to kind of modify that, because the whole point in doing it was to show that there is no difference. I mean, while there is no difference in level of equality for humans and non-humans. We're all just, living beings floating on a giant rock in the sky, and that we should all, be considered fundamentally equal. And I wasn't going to give that up. And so I didn't publish that there. Sometimes this is going to happen. This goes back to my point about languages. not only do we sometimes speak different languages to one another because we're coming from these different disciplines and we speak differently about these things and conceive these things differently, but also in just the animal space generally, we speak differently than people who don't usually think about animals, because their default for thinking about animals are the images they get on billboards and TV every day. All they see, the vast majority of their contact with animals is in fried corpses. And that's the vast majority of time they spend with animals. And so they have been conditioned away from seeing kind of the basic existence of everybody else on Earth because of the human supremacy claims made in our cultural conduct. And so if the point of our research is to challenge that cultural conduct and argue that it is fundamentally flawed, then I would argue that no, there are places that we can't compromise. Now, if it's something like saying animal instead of non-human animal, yes, I would totally do that. I mean, those are just kind of linguistic things. I'd be happy to do that if it meant getting that message out. But if it meant changing some kind of fundamental kind of dicta of the way I think about animals and the way I've conceived them, even if it meant getting that message out to a broader audience, I would suggest no. Though again, let me say that I really do believe that if you asked 10 people here in the Zoom room, you'd get 10 completely different answers on that, because there isn't a right one. And because animal people themselves don't necessarily agree on these issues. And so, yeah, I think that's where I would go with that. I very much want to make that missionary transition whenever I can. My goal in this business is to use what I'm good at to help animals, but there are certain compromises that I just really probably wouldn't make.
Thank you so much. So I have a couple questions here that I'm going to try to create a question out of, sort of wrap them together. Sure. So Sadie's talking about how they are working on a PhD and have been sort of told, here's the go-to journals you publish in. And Mary's talking about how sometimes when you go to these journals that are outside of these go-to journals, right, it's not as respected maybe in academia. So both of these questions, I think, are really revolving around the idea that there are disciplinary standards and expectations, which place higher value on disciplinary journals versus these specialty field journals, like in critical animal studies and human animal studies, that don't actually fit into any disciplinary department that any of us might be housed on. So, Sadie's worried, could that affect me even getting a PhD? And Mary asks, can this hurt the way your research agenda is viewed? And also asks if the collaborative nature of the work that you have personally published, Tom, if that has impacted the way that your work is respected and valued.
Right. Those are all great questions. And the answer is no, it would not affect your PhD. And journals like Society, now I will say that the list that I gave you of ASI's list from the ASI website of the list of journals, those are not all created equal. To be sure. I mean, they're all very different. They're all from different places. They have different focuses. Some are more accepting than others. But I'll take, for example, Society and Animals, the core journal of Animal and Society Institute. That journal will count in your promotion and tenure document just as well as any other. You can use its acceptance metrics and its output metrics
all the metrics that we have for various journals to judge what counts as good and what counts as not, how discriminating a journal might be, in other words, I guarantee you that Anthrozoos, other journals like that would totally fit into any of those metrics. And so just because it's outside of a specific discipline, if you can demonstrate the worth of the journal through those metrics in your promotion and tenure document, or I should say, for graduate, in your job applications, you should be fine there. That should not be a problem. There are better and worse journals. My advice is, if you are a young scholar, I would start, first of all, just know that you have time. And because you have time, I would send your work to the journals that you most want to publish in. And if they don't like it, I guarantee you that even with your rejection, your peer review is going to give you great ideas on how to make it better, and you'll be able to send it to the next one down on your list. I would make a list of the journals that you would like to see publish your work and just try. That said, I tend to publish in the journals that are nice to me and that give me support and that have a relatively quick turnaround time. That isn't always the case with the big ones. I mean, I'll publish with the big ones sometimes too, just because it's kind of what we do. But for the most part, I'd much prefer to publish with, like, for example, a state historical journal over a national historical journal, because they're nicer, because they're far more friendly, they're far more willing to accept my ideas. And I know that everybody who cares about the subject is going to find that article, and they are going to be able to read it, and they are going to be able to use it. And as long as it gets out in the world, that is great. Then there is collaborative work, which is interesting. The paper I showed with myself on the screen that was collaborative, that's only one of 2 papers I've ever done collaboratively. And I'm just kind of getting into collaborative work. I have a group of friends with whom I've been writing a few articles, and it is a really fun process. And I think it is incredibly valuable because you get different voices in one piece, and it really has affected the way I think about a lot of these animal issues, but it's not something that I normally do. My original field before I went into animal studies was history, and historians are not a team writing bunch. We are a loner writing bunch. And so the vast majority of my work has all been individually written. I will say, though, that in talking with people, because of this kind of new collaborative bent that I've been doing, when I've been talking to people, I've been told that collaborative work is still valuable for promotion and tenure, that if you do it, you want to try to be, believe me, now I'm just telling you this secondhand because I am not someone who is an expert in collaborative work because I normally work alone, that you want to be the first author listed, that somehow has more value than being the second one. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but that's certainly what I've heard. And I also consulted, anticipating this might be a thing, I consulted my department head at my university who told me that theoretically, if someone had a promotion document, let's just say, to get tenure at a university, and all of their publications were written collaboratively, that would be seen as an issue. But if you have collaborative publications in concert with publications that you've done on your own, then the collaborative publications end up counting just as much as the others. So my advice on the subject would be, A, work collaboratively. I had never done it before, and I have really found it rewarding. Not only are you reading other people's ideas, but you're actually working with them to write something out. It is incredibly interesting, and it is incredibly, I think, beneficial to your overall production. At the same time, I would tell you to never do collaborative work to the detriment of your own individual projects. As long as you do both, then collaborative work should be of value added to your resume.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions and we are almost out of time. So maybe we'll think of a creative way to get to some of these questions and send people some information back, or Tom also put up his email address.
Absolutely.
So you can email Tom. Do you want to put it again in the chat for anyone?
Yeah, I do. And also, if they're just a bunch that that all look relatively similar, I am happy to just take them all and write up an answer and send it out to people. I'm sure people had to put in an email address to register for this.
Yep. I have people's emails. So what
I'm happy to answer all the questions and send them out. That is no problem at all.
Well, that is wonderful. So what I'll do is try to put some sort of order to these questions, find a way to save them before I go ahead and log off. And then we can communicate over email, and or Tom and I will communicate. And then when I email everyone with the recording of this, we will let you know how you can get the answer to some of those questions. So I would like to thank everyone for being here today. I would especially like to thank Tom. So thank you so much. This was really great. I wish we had slated more time for it, but then it might have been harder for some people to attend.
Thank you for coming, everyone.